871 in medic 6, you're seeing a 74-year-old male, shortness of breath.
Managing multiple patients is difficult in the best of circumstances, but when you add the challenges of a dangerous scene, you have the potential for chaos. That is, unless you are prepared. Regardless of the size of the event, when it comes to delivering care, the strategies for patient management are the same. In this program, we will focus on patient management. Planning and training are essential to preparedness. Lieutenant Colin Whitmore, the EMS commander in charge at the Virginia Tech shootings in April of 2007, learned this firsthand.
We had actually trained on the active shooter scenario many times. It was something that the rescue squad had assessed as a potential threat to the university because it has so many large classrooms and large buildings with such a high number of students in them that the potential consequence was pretty high. So from a hazard vulnerability standpoint, it's a particularly serious hazard that we had. So we had done many tabletops on it and some significant full-scale exercises within the department.
All I know is we have nine victims right now. I've seen some walking wounded and some that are non-ambulatory right now.
Using the incident management system on a daily basis on smaller routine calls can increase your success during stressful larger events. Chief of EMS John Politis from Town of Colony, New York, shares his experiences regarding the use of IMS.
I think one of the first things is to get used to using the basic principles of command and control in your daily practice. And one of the things that many agencies do today is they have a very low threshold for implementing their incident management system. Agencies, I think, that utilize incident management at small things such as car accidents where there are 2 or more patients or there are going to be multiple units, get used to using basic command and control principles, and they get used to triaging patients. I think that's critical for getting good at multiple casualty incident management. If you don't have this woven into your daily practice, when the big one hits, you're not likely to remember how to do it. So I think you have to do it every day.
Regardless of the type of event, your first priority is your safety, especially when faced with a situation of violence. You can start anticipating your needs and activate the command system, but you'll most likely be on standby waiting for information.
During the initial phases of the incident, one of the biggest challenges that we had was that we didn't have a lot of information. The building was a safety hazard. We couldn't send people inside to assess the situation and get an idea of how many patients we were going to have. And because of that, we had to wait for the police to give us that information. Their primary concern is locking down the facility and making sure that if the suspect is still inside the building, that they're able to contain him. That took a while because the facility was large, which meant that we didn't have any information that we would normally use to pick the number of units that we're going to ask to respond. So initially, our biggest concern was the safety of the responders and the number of patients that were inside, and that was the information we needed.
Defining what constitutes an MCI is very subjective. It's dictated by what your system can handle, what resources are immediately available. If you are in a rural area, it might not take too many trauma patients to overwhelm your system. If you are in a metropolitan area, you may be able to handle 25 patients or more.
A multiple casualty situation is an incident in which your resources are overwhelmed, where your resources are not sufficient for you to continue to do day-to-day patient care as you normally would. While it might be perfectly acceptable to work a trauma cardiac arrest attempt on a single patient, of course depending upon the circumstances, when you have a multiple casualty incident, that would essentially sap all of your resources, and it wouldn't be appropriate necessarily to work in a resuscitation attempt on a traumatic arrest. One of the common things that happens at multiple casualty incidents is that we have to use a collection area. And that collection area is an area where we're going to bring patients back to that area to re-triage them and to do some care while we're waiting for transportation to occur. Even in that treatment area where we might have perhaps more resources, the resources that you have will be limited and will not be of the same capacity often as what you will have in day-to-day EMS. So it's important for everyone to realize that you do need to really rethink your treatment priorities in your resource allocation when you're managing a multiple casualty incident.
Sometimes you won't have all the information you need, so plan for the worst-case scenario. The most common pitfall in incident response is not calling early and not calling for enough resources.
We received information over the police frequency that there were shots fired in Norris Hall. When we received that information, we went ahead and made the decision to enact the incident action plan, and that called for contacting the Montgomery County Emergency Services Coordinator so that he could put the other squads on standby.
The goal in MCI management is to achieve the greatest good for the greatest number, to make the best use of personnel and equipment, and not relocate the disaster elsewhere. Key strategies for patient management include triage, treatment, and transport. Creating these sectors and assigning unit leader roles should be one of the first priorities for the IC. The initial response to any MCI begins with the scene size-up. After you have deemed the scene as safe to enter, you need to determine the nature of the incident, estimate the number of patients, and then begin or direct triage activities.
What you got?
We have 3 patients on the inside and 5 patients on the outside.
Okay, I've got 3 type blacks and type red on the other side. If you go ahead and triage tag these guys and swing over the other side and catch the guys over there, right. I'll meet you back up here.
It's very tempting when you arrive at the scene of a multiple casualty incident to shift back into what you're really good at doing, which is providing patient care, when what you need to be doing is spending 30 to 60 seconds on each patient, quickly opening an airway, doing this very basic care, instructing someone how to stop bleeding, triaging that patient, and then moving on to the next so you can get through all of the patients.
I think the interesting thing about triage in a mass casualty incident is that it never goes the way it does in a drill. In a drill, everyone kind of walks into the building and reads the card and ties the tag to the patient. Of course, it doesn't work that way in real life. You're going to have patients that want help, that want you to stay with them, and don't understand that you need to do the greatest good for the greatest number. And so one of the things that was tough for our triage teams inside the building was making sure that they were able to get to every patient and accurately assess them in a timely fashion. We were lucky that we had tactical medics inside the building with the SWAT teams that had already begun some initial triage, which allowed us to more rapidly assess some of the patients and get the critical patients out faster.
The response to an MCI is designated in levels. Level 1 involves 2 to 10 patients. Level 2, 11 to 25 patients. And Level 3 would include 26 or more. Delays in requests for transportation or additional EMS resources can have critical consequences for your patients. The number of patients and the severity of the injuries will determine how many ambulances you need. Generally, 2 to 5 ambulances are needed for Level 1, 5 to 10 for Level 2, and 10 or more for a Level 3 response. Another critical piece is early notification of your area hospitals. They need to be staffed and ready to receive the injured.
We were lucky in Southwest Virginia that we have a close working relationship with a lot of the facilities that we transport to regularly, and also that they have a close working relationship with each other. So once they knew that they were going to be getting a lot of patients, they started communicating about the level of availability as far as beds and things of that nature. They also canceled all of their elective surgeries and moved all of their non-critical patients out of the ER so that we had as many beds as possible that were available.
St. Luke South, no red, 2 yellow, 3 green. Did you copy?
Copy that back.
Triage activities need to match the incident. Larger incidents should entail a formal triage plan, although it is now commonly recommended that all incidents, large or small, use triage tags and implement the National Incident Command System. This ensures consistent terminology and procedures.
One of the most common things I think that responders make mistakes at are simply not putting triage tags on. I think one way to help alleviate that problem is to weave the techniques of multiple casualty incident management into your daily practice, to get used to using triage tags at small incidents when you have 2 or more patients, and even go so far as to put a handful of triage tags in whatever your first out bag is, so you have them available to you and you get used to using them even at small incidents, at things such as car accidents, where again you may have secondary responders and you want to prevent patients from getting re-triaged.
In some instances, the decision will be made to treat in place. At other times, the patient is moved to a treatment or casualty collection area. The current conditions and the nature of the incident will guide your decisions.
We actually had 3 separate phases of triage. They were triaged once inside the building by an initial triage team that would come through and just apply the tag based on the algorithm. That triage tag was checked for accuracy at the door before they ever left the building. The critical patients were typically so critical that they had to be transported directly to the hospital. They didn't have time to go to the treatment area. Those who did go to the treatment area were triaged about every 15 minutes to make sure that the assessment was still accurate. Many of our green tags were upgraded to yellows, and many of the yellows were upgraded to reds.
During an incident such as a mass shooting event or terrorist situation, interagency cooperation is critical. Several triage and treatment areas may be created away from the scene. Determining factors include environmental issues or geographical obstacles, scene hazards, and the anticipated duration of operations. Law enforcement should oversee and provide security for EMS in these areas. Keys to successful triage include an initial quick category designation. Remember, patients can be re-triaged later in treatment or in transport. Do the greatest good for the greatest number. Limit the time you spend with any patient. Use triage tags to avoid confusion, to create continuity, and to save time. Understand triage criteria and classify appropriately. It's a common triage mistake to classify patients as more severe than they actually are. But depending on the types of injuries, their condition can also change rapidly. Patients are treated and transported based on their priority status.
With an active shooter incident, especially one like this one where the gunman used 2 different calibers of weapons, we had 2 very different types of injuries. Some obviously more severe than others, and some a lot less stable. So a lot of our patients that were tagged as yellow or delayed transport had to be re-triaged constantly in the treatment center so that we were able to make sure that those whose conditions changed rapidly because they were compensating when they left the building, that they got transported quickly.
Naturally, the highest priority patients, of course, are the priority 1 or red, which really need to be moved off the scene. And one of our endpoints, our benchmarks at managing a multiple casualty incident is how long it takes us to get those priority 1 or red patients off the scene. And anything that we do that inhibits getting the red patients off the scene quickly is really working against us. So at the MCI, we need to think of it like the famous eye drop. We need to get the red out. And getting the red out means getting them off the scene quickly, and that's a benchmark. And anything that we do that undermines that, such as not managing our walking wounded patients, our green patients quickly and effectively, or allowing some resource to be a tremendous distraction, is not a good thing.
If possible, the triage area should be located near the incident and accessible to vehicles. The triage officer may shift into the treatment officer role once triage has been concluded. There may be only a finite number of transport vehicles. In this case, the staging officer might also become the transportation officer. The goal is not to make the command structure complex, but to maximize the utilization of all available resources so that the operation is effective and efficient.
See that flagging right there?
Yeah.
And that guy in the blue?
Yeah.
I need you to go over and see him.
Okay.
Dealing with the walking wounded or priority 3 patients can be a big challenge at an MCI. Designate law enforcement or other personnel to collect these patients and get them out of the way so you can gain access to the higher priority patients. Once patients are moved from triage areas to treatment, they can be re-triaged and grouped by their priority status. Each treatment area should be adequately staffed to handle the incoming patient load. Medical care should be limited to urgent needs. It's important that this area is carefully monitored by the treatment officer. The demand for equipment and supplies, as well as the need for personnel, may fluctuate. The treatment officer may need to shift personnel from one treatment area to another or secure additional medical supplies.
I think one of the very best places to have high-end medical resources such as emergency physicians is in that treatment area to be able to make those tough decisions about what patients should be getting more care than others and how patients should be re-triaged and prioritized for transportation.
Ideally, after patients are stabilized, they are then transported from the incident to a medical facility. The treatment officer coordinates the movement of patients with the transportation officer. Patients often enter the treatment area faster than they are transported. This can cause a backlog of patients waiting for transport. It's imperative that the transportation officer has enough transporting resources. In addition to ambulances or air transport, this would also include procuring buses or other vehicles to move patients to definitive care. If your agency doesn't have the resources, you should know who to call.
In many places that I know of in this country, and in fact some places that I work, there are a very small number of resources. In fact, in the entire county, there's only about probably 4 to 5 ambulances, and the nearest mutual aid is 75 to 100 miles away. And they have a pre-plan for how they're going to move multiple casualties, using ambulance-like vehicles, cargo vans, passenger vans, and they have really mentally prepared and pre-planned what they would have to do to deal with a multiple casualty incident in that frontier wilderness area.
Whenever possible, involve mutual aid in your training drills. Many agencies are volunteer, with limited personnel. Having resources identified and established relationships in place will increase the success of your response.
Mutual aid in Southwest Virginia is a particularly difficult thing because all of the agencies are volunteer with very few exceptions. Because of that, most of those agencies have a hard time getting an ALS ambulance to their own calls during the day. So we rely heavily on mutual aid. But to have 27 in 30 minutes was truly amazing. I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that before we were ever dispatched to the call, we had gone ahead and contacted the emergency manager in our area and asked him to put all the other stations on standby, which allowed us, once we knew what the situation was, to have those ambulances respond, and all of them were there pretty quickly thereafter. So it was about 30 minutes before every unit had arrived that we would use throughout the day.
The transportation officer will also coordinate with the staging officer to establish loading areas and helicopter landing areas. A patient is loaded based on their priority status.
There's an old saying that sometimes slower is really faster, that we have to be careful not to squander too many of our resources on patients, that we have to try and flatten our resources out to try and do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. I think helicopters can be a tremendous resource at a multiple casualty incident, but I've also seen transportation from multiple casualty incidents stop for 30 to 45 minutes while a helicopter is landing, is getting a patient ready for transportation, and then is taking off where no transportation from the scene was occurring. So I think you have to be very careful about how you use your resources, and be careful that what you're doing does not become a negative force multiplier. And I think the two areas that I've seen that can become negative force multipliers are not managing the walking wounded, priority 3 patients, in an effective manner, and also utilizing resources that may be a very large distraction and may only transport 1 patient from the scene.
Failure to follow an organized approach to an MCI can cause several critical problems. If triage is based on emotional factors instead of objective criteria, vital resources will be poorly used and critical patients will remain on scene and not get priority transport.
Okay, I'll be right back around. Hey, stay right with them, okay?
Contact must be maintained regarding which receiving hospitals are best able to handle the incoming patients. Tracking patients and maintaining a record of the hospital destination is an important part of the transportation officer's role. This will help avoid overloading a hospital.
Transporting happened quickly because we were lucky enough to have 27 advanced life support ambulances on the scene within about 30 minutes. However, documentation was a consistent challenge. It's tough to keep track of that many people going that many different places, and it did take us some time after the incident to figure out exactly who transported which patients. We didn't assign documentation to any particular person. We did, however, use the Virginia triage tags, which allow for barcoding of the patients and patient numbering. Unfortunately, at one point during the day, we did run out of the available triage tags and had to redeliver more, which meant we had to go to a secondary triage method of using the tape that we had as a backup. That was where some of the confusion came in, and it probably would have helped to have some additional tags on hand or someone who was responsible for keeping track of who these patients were and where they were going.
So how can EMS improve their capability when treating multiple patients?
Complacency is the greatest enemy of preparedness. We're all guilty of being complacent about things that just seem so far away from a real possibility in our area. But an incident, especially like an active shooter incident, is something that can really happen anywhere and any time. So That kind of leads me to the second lesson that we learned, which is something we kind of knew and it just reinforced for us, that there really isn't any substitute for realistic and timely training.
I think you have to think about it. In the fire service prepares for the multiple alarm fire, the big warehouse fire, the major conflagration, which requires an awful lot of resources and manpower to treat or manage that incident. I think in emergency medical services, it's important for everyone, from the field provider to the EMS chief, to be thinking about what will happen in our community if we have a multiple casualty incident, and to pre-plan the types of multiple casualty incidents that are likely to occur. While a major building collapse might not be a likely possibility in many communities in America, there are school buses that go through every community in the United States, and there are different types of transportation incidents that can occur. And I think it's important to pre-plan incidents, both on paper and mentally, to think about what you might need to do and where would you get the resources to manage these patients.
In order to be prepared to handle big events, you have to be good at the small ones.
If you can't handle 2 or 3 patients, handling 20 or 30 patients is not going to be any easier. You have to get really good at handling small incidents. Many of the motor vehicle crashes we go to are very minor. There are minor injuries. And at times, your colleagues will often think that you're silly, that you're overreacting for using triage tags and for shifting into a command and control mode at those small incidents. I think they'll believe that for a time. And then the first time something happens where it's a major incident and everyone knows how to do command and control, knows how to unify command with other agencies, knows how to use triage tags, has good scene cooperation, and the scene works well, everyone will then understand why it's necessary to do this at small incidents.
Be prepared. Know what is designated as an MCI in your jurisdiction. Know where additional resources will come from and practice with mutual aid. All of this helps EMS providers prepare for the unthinkable. When it comes to mass casualty response, the unthinkable should be anticipated and planned for.
I don't think that you can ever be fully prepared for an incident like an active shooter. I think that you can train, you can get your operations ready, but mentally and emotionally it's always going to be something that's tough on everybody that responds. Because of that, you can never be 100% prepared for it.
One of your biggest challenges during an MCI response will be to remain focused and to not become overwhelmed.
Locate stolen vehicle out of Delta County from Paonia.